The latest CPI inflation report is out, and according to the US government, inflation is cooling. They're telling us that inflation has now dropped to 2.7%. Sounds like good news. Right. Well, before we celebrate, I want you to understand exactly what this report is saying and what it is not saying, because lower inflation does not mean prices are coming down. It simply means prices are rising more slowly than before. And when you look deeper into this report, especially when you combine it with what the Federal Reserve is doing, a very different picture starts to emerge. So let's break this down step by step. What the CPI report actually says. According to the latest CPI report, headline inflation came in at 2.7%. Core inflation, which excludes food and energy, came in at 2.6%. Now here's why this caught people off guard. In the previous report, inflation was sitting at 3.0%. Economists were expecting inflation to increase to 3.1%. Instead, it dropped. So on the surface, this looks like a win. But remember, inflation falling from 3.0% to 0.7% does not mean life is getting cheaper. It only means prices are still rising, just not as fast. Everything that already went up in price, that's staying up. According to the latest CPI report, headline inflation came in at 2.7%. Core inflation, which excludes food and energy, came in at 2.6%. Now here's why this caught people off guard. In the previous report, inflation was sitting at 3.0%. Economists were expecting inflation to increase to 3.1%. Instead, it dropped. So on the surface, this looks like a win. But remember, inflation falling from 3.0% to 0.7% does not mean life is getting cheaper. It only means prices are still rising, just not as fast. Everything that already went up in price, that's staying up. According to the latest CPI report, headline inflation came in at 2.7%. Core inflation, which excludes food and energy, came in at 2.6%. Now here's why this caught people off guard. In the previous report, inflation was sitting at 3.0%. Economists were expecting inflation to increase to 3.1%. Instead, it dropped. So on the surface, this looks like a win. But remember, inflation falling from 3.0% to 0.7% does not mean life is getting cheaper. It only means prices are still rising, just not as fast. Everything that already went up in price, that's staying up. Why prices still feel high. This is where a lot of people get confused. If inflation is cooling, why does everything still feel expensive? Because inflation measures the rate of increase, not the price level. Think of it like a car. If you're going 100 miles per hour and slow down to 70, you're still moving forward. Prices didn't reverse. They just slowed down. And when you zoom out, inflation is still above the Federal Reserve's target of 2.0%. In fact, even at 2.7%, inflation is still 35% higher than their stated goal. And here's the bigger issue. Inflation has been sticky for years. If you look at inflation since 2021 and 2022, you'll notice something important. Inflation came down from its peak, yes, but for 5 years now, the Federal Reserve has failed to bring inflation back to its 2% target. It's been sticky. It refuses to go away. And that raises a serious question. Is the Federal Reserve actually serious about fighting inflation? Because when you look at their actions, not their words, things don't line up. The Fed is cutting rates. Let's talk about interest rates. At a time when inflation is still above target, the Federal Reserve has been cutting interest rates. Lower interest rates encourage borrowing, spending, risk-taking, and all of that is inflationary. So ask yourself, how do you fight inflation? By making borrowing cheaper. That alone raises eyebrows, but it doesn't stop there. The money printers are back on. On December 12th, the Federal Reserve quietly turned the money printers back on. They started with roughly $40 billion per month. That's new money being injected into the system. And printing money is, by definition, inflationary. So let's pause and think about this logically. Inflation is above target, interest rates are being cut, money printing as Reza Meadows. That sound like a central bank that's serious about price stability. What the Fed is really prioritizing. In my opinion, the Federal Reserve's priorities are pretty clear. They appear far more concerned with propping up financial markets, supporting banks, managing government debt, and remember, the U.S. national debt is enormous. Higher interest rates make that debt more expensive to service. So cutting rates helps the government, the banking system, asset price, but it doesn't help everyday people fighting higher costs of living. Powell's explanation: tariffs. Now, to be fair, the Federal Reserve does have an explanation. Chairman Jerome Powell has pointed to tariffs as a major contributor to inflation. According to Powell, tariff-related inflation is likely to be, and this is his quote, a one-time price increase. In other words, he's saying inflation was pushed higher in 2025 because of tariffs, but things should cool off in 2026. That's the argument. The Federal Reserve also says they're more worried about the labor market right now. That's their justification for cutting rates, printing money, and maybe they're right, but when you look at the full picture, one thing is clear: inflation may be cooling on paper, but the policies being implemented are still inflationary. So the big question remains, are we actually winning the fight against inflation? Or are we just delaying the consequences? And you know, I'm right there with you. So I just wanted to address that. All right. Let me know what you think about the situation. Please subscribe. Thank you for the support, and I wish you a very nice day. Take care.